Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. Paul, welcome to the podcast. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. Very, not quite as busy as yourself from our previous conversation, but very busy in a wonderful way. But that's why I'm very appreciative of your time. And it's something I really wanted to get in just as a frame of reference for people coming into the podcast. It's your work is very wide reaching, but the purposes of today's conversation, you are a professor and expert in effectively lithium-ion battery fires, and you work with a whole host of people you work in Newcastle University, you're a senior advisor in the National Fire Chiefs Council, you're a subject matter expert, you do some cross-government technical steering group for the electric vehicle fire safety, and you've done work collaborating with the NFCC and some testing at the Fire Service College. Is that right?
Yes, indeed, and done fire extinguisher tests down at the wonderful Durham Fire and Rescue Service facility, the training facility. He's making me sound a lot more important and successful than I actually am, so thank you for that.
I think when we connect the dots looking backwards, sometimes it can come as a surprise even to ourselves, probably more so you than me, how much you probably have gotten into across your career. But I wonder if you could take us for a second as to how you did arrive at this point here and why your interest in subjects such as this have taken you to be somewhat of a subject matter expert. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together.
Well, it all really started back in about 2010 when I was asked to join an EU-funded research project looking at trying to speed up quality control assessment of lithium-ion cells on the production line.
Okay.
And there were a number of industrial partners, including Nissan. And Nissan asked for help because they were just in the process of building the battery plant. Okay. And they wanted help in terms of the chemical safety surrounding lithium-ion batteries. Nothing to do with the kind of challenges we're seeing now. We had no idea in those days. So I worked with them for about 3 years. I've kept up the relationship since and maintained the relationship when the battery plant was bought out by Envision AESC, who now basically run the battery plant, which remains the only gigafactory, lithium-ion gigafactory in the country. Well, that EU project morphed into a second EU project. Again, this time we were still really looking at speeding up the assessment of quality control. In other words, could we identify dodgy lithium-ion batteries more quickly than they were doing in the plant?
Okay.
And we had a certain degree of success. And then the Faraday Institution was formed in around 2018, which was the government funding body, which was aiming at getting a lithium-ion battery industry going in the UK. And I was asked to join what's called the RELIB project, recycling and reuse of lithium-ion batteries. And this time we were looking at the fact that lithium batteries were basically being used in electric vehicles, but when they reach about 80% what's called state of health, in other words, when they've lost 20% of their capacity irreversibly, they're classified as no longer any good in electric vehicles.
Really?
But they've still got loads of energy and they're very valuable. So they were being used in other industries, for example, for grid scale energy storage. But could we actually work out a way of saying how long they were going to last? You know, it's no use buying a battery if within a couple of weeks it's dead. Secondhand battery.
So they're quite a hell of an investment as well, still, aren't they?
Oh, they're a huge investment. So that's what we were looking at. But I kind of got sidetracked because I'd started hearing about these electric vehicles burning and exploding. And I gave a kind of very high level presentation at our first review meeting on the safety of lithium-ion batteries. And
how did that go down?
Well, even then it opened a few eyes. I
Yeah.
didn't quite create the number of pale faces I do now, but it was quite satisfying. Anyway, a guy from the UK Metals Recycling Association came up afterwards and told me about the fires they were having in recycling facilities because of lithium-ion batteries. And kind of that's when it all took off, really. I read more and more, learned more and more, and contacted Tyne and Wear Fire and Rescue Service and offered to give them a presentation, which they joyfully agreed. Became kind of a advisor to them, and then started rather sneakily doing ignition tests under the Relib banner, which the money wasn't actually intended for. But the first tests we did in January 2020, we invited Fire and Rescue Services, the HSC, and everybody around, because nobody had done it with that size battery before.
This is what I'm saying, though, and that's kind of what really worries me, because you're talking here, like, I mean, what you said there, 2010. What worries me now is, like, the public sector with the funding and the challenges in any government organization. Well, I very much feel like we are behind the curve in our relationships with manufacturers. And when some of this stuff starts coming over the hill, if we haven't got inquisitive individuals such as yourself just on the outside of their mind thinking about, what does this look like when it goes wrong? Because technology and advancement is so exciting, and we see this absolute explosion in energy storage and transport and consumer electrics. But those hazards that it is posing through that sort of ignition route and the breakdown and the toxicity and how we would deal with it and the gases that gets released, that must be part of the, for want of a better description, like corporate risk assessment when we're making this stuff.
Well, it's this law of unintended consequences. You know, I've got major OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, asking me for help. They make lithium batteries, and they're asking me for help to understand the hazards. It's because essentially large batteries, really, electric vehicles, grid scale systems, didn't appear until 2008. Okay, now we'd had problems with small batteries in computers and things like that beforehand. But remember, lithium batteries were discovered around the mid-80s and first commercialized in 1991 in portable electronic devices. But it wasn't until 2008 with the Tesla Roadster, and also almost simultaneously with the first grid scale system, that big batteries appeared. Okay. Now we've had 120 years, 30, 40 years to learn about internal combustion engines, petrol and diesel driven systems. We've only had since 2008 to really start understanding the big batteries and the implications they have. And don't forget, the lead acid battery was discovered in 1859 in France and immediately commercialized. And it's been around ever since. And people are used to it. And the problem is that most people assume that a lithium-ion battery is just the same as a lead acid battery, and it's not. It's
that pace of change and how much of an appetite and return on investment it has for the economy has caused. It's almost like that battery on steroids, because the way that this is accelerated through industry and just proliferated through the entirety of public because of how theoretically cheap it is to make, or even though it's not cheap to make, but how much money can be made.
Well, it's a lot cheaper than it was. The price has dropped over tenfold in the last few years. I mean, it's. But
that's also concerning, because then more people are getting into the market of manufacturing these without potentially.
That's the flip side. Yes.
Yeah.
You've got to understand, though. I'm not trying to demonize these. The reason that they're so prolific is that they are fantastic devices. They really are. But, and this comes back to your key point, the rate at which they've penetrated all levels of our society, in my view, has far outstripped our understanding of the risks and hazards. And the trouble is that major industries are now starting to wake up and kind of, in some cases, not quite panic, but really, their eyes are going very wide and there's a kind of pale face appearing.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a comparison. I might be stretching for an analogy here, but when I remember all the work that was done with asbestos and how that was used, so it was like the miracle mineral, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was used in all sorts of construction and materials and clothing and everything like that. And then we realized it was all around us, and we went, "Oh God, it's really dangerous in ways," but only if not handled correctly, I suppose.
Well, this is the problem, and I think a lot of the problem with lithium batteries is regulation.
Okay.
That it's in many ways, and I'll probably get brick bats thrown at me for this, but in many ways, in many areas, it's the Wild West out there in terms of unregulated behavior. And that's what concerns me. But also, what you've got is a highly energetic device, and the public with essentially no knowledge of it. And they can buy secondhand, they can buy an electric vehicle battery that might have been abused to the point of being unstable. They won't know. They can buy it, throw it in the back of their van or truck, drive home, disassemble it, and make a battery energy storage system for the solar array.
Yeah.
And this unregulated trade is putting the public very much at risk, in my view.
And selfishly for me, we're the ones turning up to help and try and resolve and try and make calm out of chaos, and we don't even have the greatest level of understanding.
Well,
and even once we get that level of understanding, you'll know far better than me working with manufacturers to then put together a solution for it, and an ability for us to suppress or fight this is an even longer journey. I wanted to just jump back for a second before we skip over it. Could you just go through the principal differences of lithium-ion batteries versus a normal battery? I didn't want to skip over that, sorry.
Okay, well, normal batteries, yes, conventional batteries all use water as what's called the electrolyte. The electrolyte is the solvent plus the salt that's dissolved in it to make the water ionically conducting. So all conventional batteries use water with, for example, sulfuric acid is the electrolyte in lithium lead acid batteries.
So when people think of topping up a car battery, we're talking about
they basically top it up with water usually.
And it fills up the water and all that jazz. Yeah.
And there are no real plastic or flammable components inside it. The outer case is plastic, but what you're looking at is a pretty non-flammable box.
Yeah.
In contrast, your lithium-ion battery, first of all, uses an organic solvent. And essentially, the lead-acid battery voltage is 2 volts. We're now looking at voltages of lithium-ion batteries of 4.5 volts. Now, water would instantly be electrolyzed at 4.5 volts. You'd get hydrogen at one electrode and oxygen at the other. You couldn't use water. So they have to use something that has a wider stability window, as it's called. And so we use what are called organic carbonates. Now, these are organic solvents, which are flammable, basically. There's also lots of plastic components in there. So, for example, if you've got pouch cells are basically glorified crisp packets. They're metallized plastic. There's lots of plastic in there. So you also have a far, far higher energy density. The amount of energy per unit volume or per unit mass is way, way, way above, for example, that of a lead acid battery, maybe 10 times.
Okay.
So your 12-volt battery in a car, lead acid battery, would be replaced by perhaps something the size of 40 cigarette packet, a packet containing 40 cigarettes. That would be the replacement.
Yes, like so many of us have these little power banks that we carry around to charge our phones, similar to that capacity.
You'd be looking at something 10 times bigger than that if it was a lead acid battery.
Yeah.
So there's a huge amount of energy in a very small space. Now, that's great, but it comes at a price. If that energy gets out in an uncontrolled fashion, then you're in trouble. Then we are talking thermal runaway. And that's the bad boy in the story.
Okay. Take us into thermal runaway. So we're talking there about unstable lithium-ion batteries, the aspects of penetration, overheating, overcharging.
Yeah.
Go as, remember, I'm a knuckle dragging firefighter with the greatest respect to the firefighters. Try and break it down so that I'll be able to follow you through this journey.
Right. Well, essentially, let's take a step back. Lithium-ion batteries should not exist. They are what's called thermodynamically unstable. When you first charge the lithium-ion battery, and essentially what happens when you charge is that you push lithium ions into what's called the graphite anode. Literally, it's soot. It's soot smeared on a copper foil. That's what it is. Okay. The lithium ions go into the soot particles, and when they do that, they go really high in energy. They're at a very high energy. Now, that's too high for the solvent to tolerate. So the solvent immediately reacts and it generates hydrogen and methane and all sorts of other gases that are both explosive and toxic. Now, if that continued, because that's also an exothermic reaction, it gives out heat, and heat speeds up chemical processes to produce even more heat and even more gases. You get an explosion. But what actually happens at the same time is that a protective layer forms around the graphite particles, the soot particles, and it's like a prophylactic. It stops the solvent particles touching the graphite anymore, but it still allows free passage of lithium ions. Okay. So that solid electrolyte interface, which we don't actually know precisely what it is. We know kind of what it is, but we don't know precisely. That's why lithium-ion batteries exist. It's a serendipitous safety system. And when you get thermal runaway, it's usually because that solid electrolyte interface, for some reason, has been eroded or removed.
So that's the key barrier for stopping that exothermic reaction.
So basically, when lithium-ion cells are made in the factories, they are stored at a low state of charge for 2 weeks to make sure that SEI, as it's called, forms in a nice compact layer. And as I said, this now brings us into abuse. So if you heat it, if you penetrate it, if you crush, then all of these can result in that solid electrolyte interface essentially being destroyed or eroded, and that those exothermic chemical processes start again.
Now, so not a tremendously ideal thing to be putting in something that is going to travel at speed and potentially collide.
Well, don't forget, we've gone to the moon. We've got petrochemical industry. We've got the nuclear industry. As a world, we are very, very good at managing risk.
Yes,
and we will manage risk. And you have to also remember that of the 16 million electric vehicles that are currently running around this planet, there's only been, up until a week ago, 350 verified fires and explosions involving electric vehicles, full battery electric vehicles, this is. Okay.
So still an extraordinarily safe operation to the right extent.
It's to a certain extent. Now, there's things we can, it's a very simplistic view, but it's probably a good point to pause at that point. But basically, abuse starts those chemical processes again. They generate heat and gases like hydrogen, methane, hydrofluoric acid gas, hydrochloric acid gas, hydrogen cyanide. That heat speeds up the processes to generate even more heat and gas. And once the heat is produced faster than it can be dissipated, then basically the cells pop and release the gases along with small droplets of the organic solvent. And that gives the vapor cloud, and it is a vapor cloud, the appearance of steam or smoke. And that's bad news if you mistake it for steam or smoke, because steam or smoke are not explosive or toxic. And you're talking very large volumes of gas. So
I've seen the experiments. I've seen a lot of the YouTube content that was on there. And that when you start to see that vapor cloud emit, because it's heavier than air, isn't it? So it doesn't disperse.
There's always two forms. We don't know the whole story yet.
Okay.
But there's always two forms. You get a heavier than air and a lighter than air. One of them will dominate. But we cannot predict at the present time which will dominate, because it seems to be something to do with the shape and size of the cells. In other words, the form factor, as it's called. A lot to do with the chemistry, because there's about 6 or 7 different chemistries. There's not just one lithium-ion battery. There's 6 or 7 different chemistries. But what is certainly the case is it looks like you get anywhere between 500 and 6,000 liters per kilowatt hour of this vapor cloud. Now, if you think about it, a typical electric vehicle might be 100 kilowatt hours. So you're looking at 50,000 to 600,000 liters of this explosive gas. But if we wind down a bit, an e-scooter or an e-bike is around 0.25 to half a kilowatt hour. Half a kilowatt hour, you're still looking at 250 to 3,000 litres of this explosive gas. And that is why we are having explosions as well as fires in people's homes due to these light electric vehicles, as they're called. There's so much produced. And we are about to submit a proposal to Fire Services Research and Training Trust, actually, where we're actually looking to really understand the vapor cloud and the implications for the fire and rescue service. Because we don't have the full knowledge of the composition. We don't know what determines the composition. We don't know what determines the explosibility, if you like, of the gas. Even what controls how much gas is produced. And it looks like, from the very few papers that study this, because most studies are more interested in fire. So they drive the battery or the electric vehicle into fire. They don't look at what happens when it just vents the vapor cloud. But it appears that perhaps it's not actually the hydrogen that explodes. It's those small droplets of the organic solvent. That then makes this business about lighter than air versus heavier than air a little bit more important when you're looking at detection, suppression, etc.
When I was looking at that flashpoint, was I right in reading it's as low as 60 degrees though anyway?
Now, basically, it's that wasn't the flashpoint. That's the point at which lithium batteries start to go unstable. The point at which that solid electrolyte interface starts to erode.
That's not very warm though. I mean, it's it's what you could hold it. You could touch it though. This is not an uncontrollable fire. You could, on a very hot summer, things could easily reach that in a high-rise car park or something like that.
I did a lecture tour for AFAC, the Fire and Rescue Authority in Australasia. And while I was in Darwin, I embarrassed my AFAC guide by going around and feeling up all the e-scooters. And they were too hot to touch. And in many cases, we could actually see that the footplate had popped because the cells underneath had gassed.
Wow.
So, yes, I think there's a whole bundle of interesting situations just waiting to happen.
I wanted to give people some practical analogies or demonstrations of places that we've seen this, and I had a little list in my head, some of the things you've covered on previous presentations. First was the incident, Parson Green Tube Station, November 21.
Yeah, that was an e-scooter that spontaneously combusted on the tube. They threw it off the tube where it burned on the platform, but the poor owner can be heard on the video you've seen coughing his guts up. And we don't know what the long-term exposure to these fumes, either the vapor cloud or the fumes, is. But the interesting thing,
it's not great.
Yeah, and that train is one long train. There's no compartments, and you could see the volume of smoke coming off. And again, the vapor cloud, 500 to 6,000 liters. If that burns, then the fumes are about half that, but that's still an enormous amount of smoke.
Well, this is one of the big concerns also when we talk about airplanes, and people travel, the different ways in people travel. Yes, in a train, you're in a contained, sometimes pressurized tube, potentially traveling underground. But when we see all these mobile phones and charging banks and every other variation of smaller, but still potentially deadly if in the right configuration, going into a sealed capsule a million miles up in the air.
Well, yes. I mean, we've had, in the last month, we've had 2 or 3 incidents on board aircraft of either laptops going up or a couple involving power banks. But when I was in Australia, I was flying from Canberra to Sydney, I think it was, and I was getting on the plane, and I noticed that the senior steward was very upset and was talking to a disabled passenger who I'd seen on one of these really up-to-date disabled scooters.
Oh God, yeah.
Well, the battery on that was exactly the same as an e-scooter battery at 0.25 kilowatt hours.
It's just a lot.
And I don't know if you've seen the video of the e-scooter vapor clouds deflagrating, but if that had gone up and vented the vapor cloud, it would have taken out the aircraft.
Yeah.
And I spent the short trip trying to work out what I would do if the e-scooter battery vented without burning, vented a vapor cloud.
Yeah.
And actually, there's not much you can do because at the cruising altitude, you can't vent to the outside,
Can't
apparently.
vent, you can't depressurize the cabin.
Yeah,
You'd
so
need to counteract it with another vapor and or disperse it to the extent where it could be inhaled and or sealed off and almost
well,
captured in an
again, you
air
see,
dump somewhere, wouldn't you? That'd
you
be
you'd be at a quarter of a kilowatt hour. You're looking at 125 to 1,500 liters of gas
yeah, it's
in
game
a
over.
relatively small volume. So,
Even if
uh,
it didn't catch fire,
yeah,
you're
exactly.
looking at an irrespirable atmosphere for everyone, probably up and to including the pilots. I wouldn't
And
know,
an
but yeah, it's a
explosive
scary
atmosphere.
thought.
Yeah, and an explosive atmosphere as well.
So I wanted to ask you for a second about, as you spoke there around, walking around and feeling up vehicles and the heat of stuff. Was I right in reading that Germany has banned electric vehicles parking in certain parking lots?
2 cities have banned electric vehicles.
Wow.
Actually, not based on an electric vehicle fire. It was actually based on an internal combustion engine fire, standard fire. But you see, the problem is, as I'm sure you're well aware as a firefighter, the problem is getting the water to where it's needed. Now,
Mm-hmm.
with an electric vehicle, just like a grid scale battery energy storage system, you can't get the water to where it's needed. In an
Yeah.
electric vehicle, the cells are inside a metal case. That metal case generally has a metal plate underneath protecting it. Above it, there is the floor, the carpets, the seats, the windows, and the chassis.
Mm.
Now, because the gas is produced at very high pressure, when it finally vents from that battery pack, it will do so through a weak point, but it's coming out at high pressure, which means that even if you could point your hose at that hole, the water wouldn't go in because there's such a huge pressure of gas coming out.
Yeah.
And putting water onto an electric vehicle is rather like when your kitchen's on fire, pouring water onto the roof of the house. It's
That's a
pointless.
great
It is
analogy.
utterly pointless. So in general, the German cities said, look, we know you can't put electric vehicle fires out. And with the highly directional flames, because they tend to be highly directional, 1,000-degree, 1,200-degree centigrade flames, the potential damage to the structure is too much of a risk. So they banned electric vehicles from their what's called parking houses. But you
Mm.
can't do that. If we are going to have a truly electric mobility society, you can't ban them from parking houses. And indeed, what's just happened is a Scandinavian ferry company has banned them from their ferries. You can't
Yeah,
do that.
well, there's just a million ways you can go with this, isn't there? But like you say, again, ultimately, it's that they're sealed in the bottom of the hull, and to have all of that, because when it comes out at the point of failure, it will be too rich to potentially ignite at that point. But like you say, in the hull of a boat, there's a big expansive area with lots of other vehicles,
Well, yes,
which would
and
make for a truly beautiful environment for lots of stuff
we've
to burn.
seen, as I said, about 5% of the 354 incidents to date, about 5% of them were vapor cloud explosions, where the vapor cloud exited from the battery pack, saturated the surrounding area, then deflagrated.
Hmm. That
I'm
was what I
actually
saw with
using.
the electric bus one in China. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's the car in Shanghai. There's the electric bus. There's any number of e-scooters, etc., e-mopeds. The fact is that because there's such a high amount of gas comes off, even small lithium-ion batteries can actually cause vapor cloud explosions.
Hmm. Now, with some of that, it would sound as though we are at least getting a little bit of a heads up that if that began to happen in front of us and it began to almost deluge this gas from its undercarriage or whatever, we might have a little bit of a warning to get everybody back, start to put some suppression in place or whatever. But I remember seeing a video, I think it's on one of your presentations as well, the Tesla crash in Moscow, where it almost, back in 2019, and it was a matter of seconds later when the entire thing appeared to just catch fire.
Well, yes, I mean that was where the battery itself exploded
Okay.
twice. There's in Shanghai in an underground garage. The driver, had driven over some debris which punctured the battery case. He then parked up, and the kind of CCTV camera caught the emission of the vapor cloud, and then the subsequent explosion which took out the cars either side. And the time from the first appearance of the vapor cloud to the actual explosion is only 6 seconds.
Yeah.
But we should remember that we are looking at a tiny fraction. 16 million electric vehicles on the road, and only to date 354 verified incidents. I'm using data from a really wonderful.
But even if there was only one, it still worries me that we don't ultimately, from my very limited knowledge, and you'll know far better than me, so please correct me, we don't seem to have an agreed solution as to the best way to deal with these, even if
no, I mean,
one in a million.
Basically, it is true that that risk is equal to the sample size times the probability of failure times the magnitude of the hazard, and the sample size is increasing all the time. Mm-hmm. And what we don't know is the effect of aging and use on the thermal stability of lithium-ion batteries. So if we look at electric vehicles, as they age, are they becoming less stable? Well, the one fact we do know is that if you rapid charge lithium-ion batteries, you do destabilize them.
But that's kind of one of the things we're all collectively trying to move towards to help the efficiency of owning an electric vehicle, isn't it? These supercharger stations that we see everywhere.
Well, yes, but again, the one thing that, if you put 3 academics in a room, you get 5 views. But the one thing that all academics accept is that if you rapid charge an electric vehicle battery, then you steadily destabilize it.
Do we know what over what period of time though? And we're not trying to cause panic here, but
no. It's there's just too little research to do the research. The one thing that's clear is that it's no use trying to extrapolate the data on a single cell to a module. It's no use trying to extrapolate that data to a battery pack, and it's no use trying to extrapolate that data to the full electric vehicle. You have to do the experiments on the full electric vehicle, or on the e-scooter, or on the grid-scale battery energy storage system. Piddling about with the cells and modules, it's all very well, and it can add to the knowledge. But you need, if you're really going to approach this from an applied view, to give you guys, for example, good information about how to deal with these fires, we need to do the full-scale tests, and those are expensive. And also, there's only a very few sites in this country where you can do them because of concerns over the environment.
Yeah, that must be the eternal frustration of you as an academic researcher, because ultimately, like you say, it's not cheap. It's very resource heavy. People may not be willing to give you these things just to set them on fire or just to see what happens to them. But ultimately, that's going to be the cost of advancement and hopefully safety in the end.
Oh yeah, and I'm frustrated that the government isn't allowing sufficient funds. It doesn't seem to realize that if you're going to do electric vehicle fires, you've got to buy an electric vehicle, or preferably more than one, and you've got to do it several times for scientific reproducibility. So it's what funding is available. It's just too little.
Am I too naive and stupid to think that the manufacturers of these vehicles should have to give a percentage of their profits to research? And you'd hope they just did it themselves as part of the manufacturing process. But am I just too silly to think that?
I wouldn't like to comment on that. I mean, that's way above my pay grade. But I think they've been caught on the hop just like the rest of us, frankly.
Okay.
But we're coming back to the point about dealing with electric vehicle fires. The kind of perceived wisdom is, wherever possible, leave them to burn, because that then means that what's left is scrap rather than a piece of dangerous goods. And also it means that when the recovery firm come to take it away and you sign it off as a fire service, you can be sure that it's not going to reignite hours, days, or weeks later in the recovery yard and cause damage, or worse still, death or injury.
But what if somebody's trapped in it?
Well, that's the nightmare scenario.
This is what I'm saying.
This is the major, because I mean, as I understand it, typically you would use a ram to push the dashboard back, and you'd anchor that on the floor of the vehicle. Well, if you do that in an electric vehicle, you risk cracking the battery case.
That's what I'm saying. We put it down into the B post, and we would effectively just start to manipulate the metal.
And this is the point at which I step back and stop basically pontificating from my mountain of a molehill of ignorance, basically, and leave it to you specialists. I do know that the likes of the UK Rescue Organisation are, really pondering this and looking at this in detail. Because we will deal with it. We will. But at the moment, it's a new challenge.
At the moment, it feels like not all winging it. That's probably very disrespectful to the people out there, but it's like we're working on a solution, but it's not like we're working on a solution and then we're going to allow these things to be out there. They're out there now. And like you just said, being caught on the hop and trying to find the solution. I wanted to ask you, just circle back for a second around these secondhand batteries. So there are a lot of stuff out there, and anybody can just go and look on some of the secondhand vehicle websites out there that you can buy damaged or crashed secondhand electric vehicles.
Yes, you can. Yeah, and you can buy the battery packs. I've seen them. A battery pack, partly covered in a tarpaulin, damaged. It says damaged. £6,000, I think it was. But very cleverly, they say buyer picks it up, because that circumvents what little rules, regulations, the Carriage of Dangerous Goods Act.
Yeah,
it circumvents that. So if you buy one of these battery packs, 400 to 800 volts, can't be switched off. What in the legal terms is called rapidly disassemble, explode to you and me. If you if you get a courier to take this, then the courier has to be ADR trained. This is under the UN 38.3 essentially. So he has to have done 10 days training, passed the exam. You have to buy a metal box, which I believe is around £50,000 to put it in.
Ooh.
And you have to inform the Department for Transport that you're about to transport it.
Okay? Yeah, they're not doing that, are they?
If you pay for a courier to pick it up. If, however, you pick it up yourself, you can throw it in the back of your truck and drive off without any of that.
That would seem, without being the pessimist, what is probably the preferred option. But was I reading that Australia have come up with a solution for this, or they're
well, Australia have introduced a certification. You have to be certified to buy these. Australia, I have to say that Australia is, in many ways, despite the fact they have far fewer electric vehicles than us, in many ways they are streets ahead in understanding the risk and rising to the challenge of dealing with the risk. So they've already got standards, for example, about locating domestic battery energy storage systems in the home. They've got this certification regulation about being able to buy electric vehicles. And, the United States is way ahead in terms of grid scale battery energy storage systems and the standards that they have to conform to. We have none, absolutely.
Talk to me about those grid size complexes, because wasn't 2 firefighters died in Beijing with one of them?
Yeah, these are, because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, you need to store the electricity they generate. Otherwise, you just have to turn them off, and it's wasting the solar or wind energy. But if you store the energy, then you can then collect it together and deliver it to the grid in a meaningful way. And lithium-ion batteries are brilliant for that. Absolutely brilliant. And so what's happening across this country and a lot of countries is that these so-called grid scale battery energy storage systems, or if you like, lithium-ion battery energy storage systems, LIBES, are springing up, and planning applications are going in all the time. Now, these are very large. Now, in Beijing, this was on top of a shopping mall. It was a relatively small system. I think it was 35 megawatt hours. But that required 235 firefighters, 45 fire tenders to contain. And as is the usual case, you can't actually put them out. And indeed, as they're going to more and more high energy density enclosures, the recommendations of some manufacturers, which are quite sensible, is that don't try and put these things out, just let them burn, just protect the surrounding containers. But the big problem is, again, the lack of education and knowledge. Our council planners, they don't know about what they should look for. Developers don't know, and people that fund these things.
It's a big, ugly thing, so they want to put it somewhere out of sight. And this is my concern from a domestic view as well.
Yeah, but
people are going to put these in their cellars, or they're going to put them in the back of their house somewhere. And
the domestic ones can be placed anywhere.
And that's what I mean. And if you say just let them burn, so we're
no,
writing
not
the
those,
off, aren't we?
I'm talking about the big ones, the big grid scale ones, essentially the ones that support the national grid. The domestic systems are my nightmare, because exactly what you've said. Out of 3,500 that were commercial systems that were put into people's homes a couple of years ago, 54% were in the loft. And that's often in new homes where the air circulation system is. And as a firefighter, you don't want fires in the loft.
No.
And 5% were under the main staircase. That is a nightmare. You can't let them burn. But the trouble is, because lithium-ion battery fires develop so quickly, by the time the fire service turns up, 5 minutes, it's no longer a lithium-ion battery fire. It's a house fire. And that's
but also like if that setup is one of solar panels and then lithium-ion setup in the loft, so we've got a fire that won't go out with an electric source we can't turn off on the top of the house where we can't access.
Yeah. Apart from that, you've got no problems, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
God forbid there's anybody stuck in the damn thing.
Well, this is it. But also, there's no way of you knowing. And the advice I give to firefighters when I do the presentations is, if you see a solar array on somebody's home or on a business or a wind turbine, assume until you're told otherwise that there's a lithium battery system in there somewhere. Because you've got no way of knowing. And it's only the grid scale, the really big systems that that the manufacturers will say, just don't try and put them out.
Hey folks, just wanted to jump in with a quick piece around firefighter health and well-being. Whether you are trying to join the fire service and pass them tricky fitness tests, if you are currently serving, or if you are coming up to that next chapter of your life, retiring from the emergency services, we get so many different questions around it. So in partnership with Fitness for the Frontline, we have come up with a series of guidance and programs specifically designed to reflect the physical elements of the role of a firefighter. So whether it's carrying an LPP across an overgrown field, lifting a ladder above your head under running it, or wrestling with cutting gear for 30 plus minutes at some kind of complicated RTC, our bodies are required to lift, push, and carry objects in very specific circumstances. That is effectively what Fitness on the Frontline focuses on, as well as the longer term aspects of overall health and wellness for our firefighters. Now, we are definitely not about to be smashing out world records or getting that beach body ready in 6 weeks rubbish. The systems and programs that we put in place are adjusted for people's current fitness levels, and they're not a prescriptive weight or a one-size-fits-all BS. It is very likely for myself personally that I'm still going to be a firefighter when I'm 60 plus, so longevity in the role is really important to me, and I know it is for so many people out there. It all starts with no obligation, 7 days worth of the programming, absolutely free. So whether you're joining, serving, or looking at the next chapter in your life, Fitness for the Frontline is designed by firefighters for firefighters. Now back to the show.
The domestic systems, to be frank, by the time you get there, it'll be a house fire.
Yeah.
And there might be an explosion, there might be a fire, whatever. But there are absolutely no regulations governing where these systems can be installed in the home. And what I generally say is, don't install them in the home. Again, the Australia and New Zealand.
But again, though, mate, sorry to interrupt you, but the perfect storm of energy costs becoming what they are now, people will be looking for these solutions.
Yes.
They'll be more appetizing than ever.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And, don't get me wrong. I'm seriously thinking about having a battery energy storage system, but
I've got solar panels. I've got 2 electric vehicles. And up until last year, we were considering getting a big battery until I started leaning back a bit and going, oh, hang on a minute.
Well, I wouldn't put it inside the house, but I'd certainly consider it for the outside. But yes, you see, in Australia and New Zealand, you're not allowed to put the battery inside the domestic environment. And it's the same in the United States, actually. So a domestic battery energy system cannot be in the domestic environment.
So we've solved those 2 problems. I'm not trying to be too disrespectful there, but it's like the third one that I was reading about was these mobile electricity supply vans when someone suddenly loses energy.
Yes.
And these are unmarked, just white vans or whatever make up. And you
the ones I've seen
someplace. But sorry, expand on what they are.
Well, the ones I've seen are not identifiable as electric vehicles. They just have exactly the same logos, etc., as the diesel vans. But for example, you could have a 60 kilowatt hour van, which is a common size of electric van battery, with a 60 kilowatt hour battery in the back. And none of the lessons that we've learned from grid scale battery energy storage systems about ventilation, cooling, monitoring what's happening inside, etc., none of those apparently have been learned. But at the moment, I think they're probably the small end. The immediate threat to health, to human health and life, are actually these light electric vehicles. They're the things that are killing people at the moment.
Okay. Because they're not snuck into, but because they go everywhere with the person, they're taken into environments where there's not enough solutions to overcome an issue should that thing begin to vent or become unstable.
Well, the problem is that they're charging them indoors.
Oh
Usually
yeah,
when they're
dragging them
asleep.
into the hallway because they don't want to leave them outside and
Yeah,
get robbed in London. So they're
yeah,
putting them just inside the
absolutely.
house and they
They
can't get
charge
out.
them in the flat. They charge them in. I mean, there's been a number gone up in flats. I mean, there was a flat fire near Grenfell Tower, and I know you'll be shuddering at that.
Yeah, no, I saw that one.
And you'd expect there to be hell breaking loose over that, but nah, 30 people evacuated.
Mm.
Not so much as a twitch. Very sad case of an Afghan refugee came to this country looking for sanctuary, charging his e-bike on the 16th floor. It went up, and rather than burn alive, he jumps out the window. More recently, we've had father and son. I think at least the father has died. I'm not sure what's happened to the son. They'll be the third and fourth fatalities from these light electric vehicles. Essentially, if one of these e-scooters, e-bikes, hoverboards, if they go into thermal runaway in your home, from the EV FireSafe website, which is a fantastic organization funded by the Australian Ministry of Defence, who are collating statistics and also offering guidance to firefighters like yourself. On their website, you have a 14% chance of dying and a 64% chance of ending up in hospital.
Jesus, that's concerning. I wanted to try and gleam a light of positivity on this because there is a lot of great work being done and you have been very, very helpful thus far. What are the current solutions out there? Because we've sat around letting them burn out, but is it David Smythe, the fire blankets? I've seen some videos of those. To what extent are they effective and are they just a temporary solution for certain instances?
I truly and honestly believe that fire blankets have a role to play, but it very much depends upon the situation, and it critically depends upon the understanding and the training of the operators. I should say that David Smythe is really responsible. His company, I think it's fireblanket.com, absolutely responsible. He let me use the video. He sent me the video where the firefighters were deployed a fire blanket but didn't understand the risks and hazards, didn't realize that whilst they'd cut off the oxygen, they basically set an electric vehicle on fire, then put a fire blanket on it. They didn't realize that the stuff that was coming through the fire blanket was actually vapor cloud because the fire was out underneath it. And because they weren't cooling the cells, they were still in thermal runaway and boiling off the vapor cloud. And then they removed the fire blanket, and one firefighter wanders close to it, and there's a small vapor cloud explosion.
Yeah, I think you see that. He's wandering around the side and he almost adjusts the curtain in some way to try and give it better coverage, and you see it flash.
He jumps back, and if there hadn't been a howling wind, I think he could have been killed.
Yeah, they're doing it on an airfield or something, aren't they?
Yeah, I think it was a Hariba Myra site, actually. But he basically, if there hadn't been a howling wind, he could have been killed or injured. As it was, the only victim was his trousers, probably. But you have to understand the risks and hazards. And in an enclosed space, such as on a vehicle deck of a ship, I don't think a fire blanket is an option.
You've not got hope in hell, have you?
Yeah, and I think fire blankets, so long as you understand what you're doing, you understand the risks, they can buy time. And so I do believe they have a role. But you really do have to understand what you're doing. You have to be fully aware of the risks. And you have to understand that putting people next to a big lithium battery in thermal runaway has a very high associated risk.
So take me back to what's currently going on. We've given a few examples of potential solutions or, effectively ways to deal with it, whilst we don't have the perfect answer. And I don't know if there ever will be such a thing. What guidance and what stuff is out there currently? And you've referenced it earlier, but what kind of work are you currently going on with or that you're aware of in the sector that people might be able to look out for? So firstly, where would you suggest people look in terms of guidance on this stuff?
Well, the first place I'd go to is the Underwriters Laboratories Fire Research Institute website, ULFRI. That has a package, a CPD package on lithium batteries. It shows the video, for example, that I show of the eyewitness account of the hazmat leader that was blown 75 feet by the surprise battery energy storage system explosion. But it has lots of excellent material, and you work your way through it. It only takes an hour and a half or something, but it's very, very good.
Just break that down for me again. I've got ULFRI.
It's the Underwriters Laboratories Fire Research Institute. If you just go there, you'll see they've got resources, which all you do is you log in, you join, doesn't cost anything, and excellent. The National Fire Protection Agency, NFPA, in the States also has guidance for various devices, including lithium batteries, electric vehicles, etc. And the NHTSA, I think it is, which is something like the National Highways something or other in the United States. Also, our own National Fire Chiefs Council is producing information and has a learning package which was created by Ben Quayle. And that's worth a look because it actually won an award that for saving a life.
Wow, good man. So I've got those two links here, and I've also got guidance document from Fire Industry Association. Would you advise, would that be worth linking and or making available to people?
Yeah, or anything and everything. Just, basically this is going to be one of the most important, the only slide that I say to fire officers, if you've remember nothing else from the next 55 slides except this one, I'll have done my job, and it's called use your common senses.
Okay.
So use your eyes, look for the vapor cloud, your ears, listen for the pop, the scream. The National Fire Chiefs, the general approach is risk assessment, then, after that, an initial risk assessment, and then after that, a proper risk assessment, stand off and think. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, very good advice.
Yeah, my sincere hope is that there is not a life hanging in the balance at the same time, because that's where the moral pressure and or public pressure comes in. Absolutely. And I know there'll be my brothers and sisters out there at the minute facing those very challenges. Thank you so much, my friend. Paul, that's been incredibly insightful for me, incredibly valuable. I have got a number of links to some of the YouTube videos that you referenced in your presentation, and I'm going to put into the notes for this podcast for everybody to go and have a look, and they can contact the podcast to be able to get access to those other two documents, because they'll need to be sent
There's also a lot of information on my LinkedIn site. If you just search Paul Christensen Lithium LinkedIn, I've got links to videos. I've got the video specifically about Second Life batteries, lithium-ion batteries, vapor cloud explosions, and elephants. And there's lots of information around there. I also run an email network, which is currently accelerating past 140 first responders, government agencies, both here and abroad, where we disseminate good practice. Always happy to add somebody to that.
I have got you there, founder, director, Lithium-ion Safety Limited Consultancy. I've got your link there. I'll add that for people to refer to as well. Thank you so much for your time today, my friend. I'm incredibly appreciative of that. That, for me, doesn't necessarily fill me with safety, but it certainly heightens my level of awareness. And I suppose it does give me an aspect of reassurance, and I'm sure everyone will feel the same, that there is a colossal amount of work ongoing out there, and we are moving ever closer to some slightly more safer solutions. So on behalf of everybody, I thank you for your continued efforts. I'm sure it can sometimes feel like a thankless task when you're trying to justify certain costs for resources and development and research and things like that. But I really appreciate what you're doing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was, in the early days, I was accused, because of the videos, of peddling lithium-ion battery porn. And I was accused also of being irresponsible for helping first responders because I was giving a bad name to lithium-ion batteries. I'm always happy to help, and everything I do with first responders is pro bono. I see it as my duty. So if you need help, specific problem, then just drop me a line. You can always contact me through LinkedIn, and my Newcastle email address is just paul.christensen@newcastle.ac for academic.uk.
Paul, thank you so much, my friend. I really appreciate your time. It's very generous of you this afternoon. I know you've got a lot coming up over the next few weeks, so I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Take care of yourself, my friend. I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks. Cheers.
Firefighters Podcast is put together to develop, inspire, and hopefully even motivate those individuals who have chosen to serve our communities and be part of the first responder family. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield. If you have enjoyed today's episode and you want to see the podcast continue, please head over to our Patreon page where you can support the ongoing efforts of the podcast. Please hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on whatever platform you're listening to. Please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.